First of all, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Pete Weldy. I'm the Regional Administrator for the Administration for Children and Families in Region 9. I'm headquartered here in San Francisco. For those of you who aren't aware, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services divides itself up into 10 different regions. Region 9, I think, is the best of the regions. We like to say obnoxiously that the American day begins and ends in Region 9, and it includes the great states of Arizona, Nevada, California, Hawaii, the Pacific Territories, freely associated states, and 157 federally recognized tribes. If you are at Understanding and Responding to Labor Trafficking, Part 2, where we're going to talk about emerging data and resources, you are absolutely at the right place. This is a follow-up to another webinar that many of you may have joined last week, where we did kind of a labor trafficking 101, and we're going to dive a little deeper today. And I'm really excited by the guests and panelists we have, and I really appreciate them taking time out of their busy schedules. You'll see here now the agenda for the day. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to say that there's some exciting conversation topics coming up in presentations. A few logistical things before I turn it over to our first presenter. The webinar is being recorded, and we're going to be sharing a list of resources afterward. That includes from the first session. We have intentionally waited to send resources. We want to do that all at once. So you'll be getting resources, slide decks, recordings, and other things after this webinar today. Also, you'll see that the chat is disabled for you, but the Q&A feature is live and working. So please don't hesitate at any point to put a question in the chat. We're going to do our best to answer those in real time. But if we can't get to them, we'll be sure to send an email with a response to your question after the webinar. There's not going to be any time for kind of a live Q&A session, though, today, because we're so jam-packed with information. So make sure you do, though, include your questions in the chat. Before I hand it over to my colleagues at Arizona State University, I just want to say that what we're going to talk about today is really hard. I want to acknowledge that, and I want to acknowledge that many of you who are either victims, survivors of trafficking yourself, know someone, or are working with victims, that either primary or secondary trauma is real, and I just hope you're taking care of yourself while you're taking care of others. And I know that we talk about trafficking rather matter-of-factly, but of course we do recognize that there are real victims every day that are victims of trafficking, and also our mission is to assist them with anything they need, and of course also bring the perpetrators to justice. So without further ado, I will toss it over to my new friend at Arizona State University, Ezekiel Dominguez, who's going to be sharing some great data. Ezekiel?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pete, for that introduction. I'm now sharing my screen, and I actually wanted to just briefly invite my co-presenter, Dr. Dominique Ritz, to just talk for a few minutes about our research office in Arizona State University. Dominique?
Thank you so much. I'm happy to see all of you here today. I'm a professor here at Arizona State University. We're the largest university in the United States. We have 181,000 students this year. And our research office spans both sex and labor trafficking. We have a housing program for sex trafficked women and their children called Phoenix Starfish Place. We also manage the human trafficking hotline here in Arizona, the only state that has a statewide hotline. Funded by our Department of Public Safety. We do outreach for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. You're going to hear about some of our important work. And then we work with our jails and prisons really extensively, our schools, our hospitals. And we have a pretty broad reach in the work we do. We also do research and evaluation. We study interventions, we create interventions, and we work within the field of human trafficking, highlighting lived experience experts who work on our staff, who work in our programs, who live in our programs. And I'm really thrilled for us to be able to present today one of our novel projects, something we think is really important as we enter more understanding of labor trafficking. So thank you so much for having us, and handing it back over to my Associate Director, Ezekiel Dominguez.
Perfect. Thanks, Dominique. So just to sort of go over the agenda that we have in store for you all today for this first sort of half of the webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about really acknowledging that current labor trafficking landscape that we have here in the United States. and really trying to set the stage as we sort of also then start talking about the actual study that Pete and Dominique just mentioned. Through that study, it'll be your traditional sort of little researchery academic method where we'll sort of talk about the findings that we that emerged, I think, in our research, and also conclude that section with some discussion and implications, really trying to, of course, break down what this research is really telling us in terms of our future direction with anti-trafficking, anti-labor trafficking efforts more specifically. And then after that, I'll hand it back over to Dr. Dominique Ritz, who will be moderating a panel for our Arizona Labor Trafficking Outreach project, which we call Project Alto. And I'll do sort of a quick little 5-minute transitionary period in between the actual paper discussion and then between our panel as well. So that's sort of what you can expect to sit with us through for the next hour or so. Exactly to Pete's point, I think we want to recognize that this presentation, based off of the pure matter that we are presenting on today, contains discussions of exploitation, abuse, and trauma that we want to acknowledge can absolutely be difficult to hear. And so we want to encourage you, of course, to take care of yourself during this section of the webinar, and please feel free to take a step away at any time for your own peace. So if you attended last week's part 1 of the webinar, you're probably most likely quite familiar with how we typically define labor trafficking here in the United States. That said, I won't spend too much time on definitions, but I will say that the year 2000 was really a watershed moment in the global fight against human trafficking, mostly because it marked the enactment of 2 pivotal pieces of legislation. The first, of course, being the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the United States, also commonly referred to as the TVPA. But we also had, around that same year, the adoption of the Palermo Protocols by the United Nations. These 2 frameworks, of course, though developed independently, really have since shaped the international and domestic responses to human trafficking. But for the context of today's webinar, we'll really be sticking to the TVPA. And so if we look at that language, they really define labor trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, for the purpose of subjection to things like involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. I will also say that the TVPA, in addition to really providing us with this language, also established quite a comprehensive federal framework for addressing human trafficking in our country. It did that by really focusing on 3 Ps, the first being prevention of trafficking, then protection of victims, and finally prosecution of traffickers. Interestingly, the TVPA, as many of us probably know, not only created new federal crimes, but also established really significant protections for victims, such as the T visa, which, if you're unfamiliar with, allows certain trafficking victims and survivors to remain here in the United States and aid in the prosecution of their traffickers. One of the sort of other additional key insights I think that we've really gained in our work is the importance of clearly distinguishing between labor trafficking and non-labor trafficking situations. A helpful way to really think about this is sort of by envisioning labor as and labor conditions as existing on a spectrum. So if we start on this far left side of the continuum, we have fair labor conditions. This is really, of course, the ideal scenario where employment practices uphold workers' rights, their dignity, and their well-being. What that typically looks like in reality is, ensuring reasonable working hours, fair wages, safe working environments, and also access to necessary social protections, really everything that contributes to a healthy and supportive workplace. And then we kind of move along that spectrum and we encounter a sort of gray nexus area that we call unfair labor conditions. These can be both formal and informal in nature, but when we look at that formality, they're typically defined by revised statutes that involve actions like interfering with an employee's right to unionize, retaliating against workers who file complaints, or really any other sort of violation of what we call the National Labor Relations Act or the NLRA. But I think we also acknowledge too that certainly unfair labor practices can also be a bit more informal, really reflecting broader mistreatment that doesn't always, again, necessarily make those headlines, but absolutely still impacts workers' lives. And then moving a little bit further along that spectrum, we enter this territory of labor violations, sometimes referred to as labor exploitation, although that term isn't always formally recognized in criminal law. But regardless, this really includes any breaches or non-compliance with labor laws and regulations. So some examples might be, failing to provide fair wages and benefits, improper record keeping, denying rest periods, or really engaging in any discriminatory hiring or promotion practices. And then finally, on that far right of that spectrum, we come to labor trafficking. And labor trafficking can certainly involve any of the issues that we've just reviewed, such as unfair conditions or labor violations, but with the additional critical factor, again, that we just learned about in the TVPA, which is those elements of force, fraud, and coercion really being used to exploit someone for labor or services. And it's those elements of force, fraud, and coercion that separates labor trafficking typically from other types of labor issues. And so if you're a researcher or you're an academic, or maybe you're even just naturally curious, you've probably found yourself wondering about the origins of the social issues that we face today. Questions might come up of, how did we get here? Where did these problems begin? These questions, of course, are not just academic. They're really essential for understanding how to navigate and solve some of these complex issues. And so we can take the term exploitation, for instance. It's a concept that, we encounter quite frequently in discussions on both social justice, but also economics. And so there was actually some really interesting work by a man named Dr. Matt Zwolinski, a contemporary philosopher, I want to say out of the University of San Diego, but don't quote me on it. But he provided some really interesting insights into this evolution of the term in a fascinating piece that he wrote back in 2001 for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But in that work, he really discusses the history of exploitation. He talks a little bit about pre-Marxian accounts that may seem, a bit more niche, but we argue are still a little bit crucial for developing that comprehensive understanding. But one of the more important concepts that he touches on is this distinction between transactional exploitation and structural exploitation. When we look at that former, the transactional exploitation, this really occurs in specific interactions where one party takes unfair advantage of another. And this is probably, I think, the form that we're probably most familiar with, especially when we talk about labor trafficking and human trafficking. These are really cases we hear about the most where, one individual or one organization directly exploits another and benefits from that exploitation. But what I argue is that we oftentimes overlook this other sort of concept known as structural exploitation. When we sort of define it, it's really sort of a more systemic form embedded within sort of the rules and norms of society. This form of exploitation, of course, disproportionately disadvantages certain groups, not necessarily always through direct interactions, but through sort of the very structure of the society that they live in. A clear example, because I know that that's sort of a hefty piece of information to sit with, but certainly I believe strongly that we have examples of those here in the United States, one of them being, of course, the agriculture sector. I won't go too much into a history lesson here, but when we look at sort of the arrival of European settlers over to the United States, right, they introduced this idea of landmarking to the current native and indigenous tribes that were inhabiting the current United States, stole, as we know, historically, a lot of land from these tribes, and then realized that, they had basically stolen too much land. They didn't have enough workers to actually meet the demands of the agriculture that they were producing. And so we know the year 1619, of course, rolled by. We saw, of course, individuals from Africa and its many countries being enslaved over and brought over really for the purpose of trying to meet that labor demand. And as we know, that slavery model really existed for several hundred years. And then following the abolishment of slavery, we still saw agriculture work specifically exploiting other communities. We saw this sort of rise of concepts like sharecropping, which was actually very problematic. But then we saw sort of an interesting sort of shift here in the United States specifically, I want to emphasize, where we were sort of relying on a solely African and African descendants labor force, and it sort of transitioned to Latino, Latina, Latinx labor force. We certainly saw that with the introduction of the Bracero program, which, as many of us probably know, was that binational, agreement between Mexico and the United States, where these Mexican workers were put through really inhumane conditions. In fact, oftentimes when they were crossing the border, they were actually being forced to shower in pesticides because the current politics at the time was a little bit fearful that these Mexican nationals were bringing over diseases and things like that, which we know was not always true. And then actually right before the Bracero program closed, we saw the H-2A visa, which if you don't know is a visa specifically for agriculture workers. What's interesting about the H-2A visa is that if anybody can really apply for and obtain an H-2A visa if you're living in Germany, Poland, Switzerland, Spain, anywhere. But I want to say, if I remember correctly, that the numbers are close to 90%, if not slightly over, of all H-2A workers are from Mexico, followed by other Latin American and Spanish-speaking countries. So again, all this to really say that when we start talking about those heavier concepts like racialized capitalism, for example, really speaks to, again, the history that our country has with, again, that concept of structural exploitation. But despite sort of all of this, historical and philosophy sort of discussions we've had about exploitation, arguably, that has happened since the dawn of time, we still see significant gaps in how we address these issues today. And so I want to draw your attention actually to the 2023 Trafficking in Persons report, which actually provided a pretty decent snapshot of how these forms of exploitation are being tackled, or rather the discrepancies in their attention. And so in fiscal year 2022, the DOJ, or the U.S. Department of Justice, conducted 613 investigations predominantly related to sex trafficking. We see, as you can observe on the slide, in stark contrast, only about 55 investigations focus primarily on labor trafficking. We also see that this imbalance, of course, continues when we look at sort of the outcomes of these investigations. For example, the DOJ prosecuted 155 predominantly sex trafficking cases, but only 7 cases predominantly involving labor trafficking. And a little bit even more telling are the conviction numbers, where there were about 248 convictions for sex trafficking in that fiscal year, compared to just 8 convictions for labor trafficking. If memory serves me correctly, that disparity between the sex and labor trafficking cases was also very much existing in that previous fiscal year of 2021 as well. But when we try to look at state level data, I can also tell you that the picture even becomes a little bit murkier. Gathering comprehensive state level data is notoriously difficult, as we'll talk about in the presentation. But it's really hypothesized that these numbers still also reflect similarly low attention to labor trafficking that we see at the national level as well. So for instance, here in the state of Arizona, where I'm from, where we are from, there was actually only 1 federal labor trafficking case prosecuted as far back as 2011. And so this scarcity of cases, of course, suggests that labor trafficking is not necessarily being adequately addressed at either the state or federal level. And so let's talk a little bit about why that is. I think one of the more common things I hear when we talk about labor trafficking here in the United States context specifically is that we simply don't know much about it because of this idea of underreporting. And I think while there is some truth to that, I also want to encourage us to really sort of take a step back and challenge that statement. First, because when we focus too much on this idea of underreporting, we sort of inadvertently place pressure on victims and survivors, right? Because it sort of suggests that it's up to them to come forward, which, as we know, can be incredibly difficult due to things like fear and trauma and other sort of circumstances that they face. But more importantly, this narrative also fails to acknowledge the bigger picture. It's not just about victims not reporting. I argue that it's also about us not really looking hard enough. And I think that we need to recognize that underreporting is actually oftentimes a symptom of deeper systemic issues like inadequate legal protections, insufficient training, but also broader social and economic factors that certainly make people vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. So instead of really accepting this idea that, we don't know enough because people aren't reporting, we really should be asking ourselves, are we doing enough to find out? Are we creating an environment where victims and survivors feel safe and supported enough to come forward? Are we looking in the right places and using the right methods? And finally, are we acknowledging that bigger picture? And so in this report that we are presenting on, we actually name some of the issues that are quite common in terms of why we're having this sort of cyclical issue. And the first is what we call muddling of trafficking terminology in research, but also awareness campaigns as well. And so one of the challenges in anti-trafficking research today that I'm actually not sure is often discussed is that conflation of terminology related to sex and labor trafficking. This issue, of course, we argue is not really just a matter of semantics, but rather has far-reaching implications for how we can recognize and also respond to these crimes. I can also tell you that within academic literature, but also certainly other formal reports produced by sometimes even federal agencies, but certainly also other anti-trafficking stakeholders around our country, that sometimes there is a tendency to employ the blanket term of human trafficking without really making necessary distinctions between sex and labor trafficking, as well as the situations in which those two can coexist as well. And so the reality from that is that this broad and non-specific use of terminology unfortunately leads to significant challenges in our ability to collect data and analyze that data, really to inform how we're sort of progressing as an anti-trafficking movement. When we fail to clearly differentiate between those forms of trafficking, we ultimately lose that ability to identify the unique characteristics, but also the dynamics of each one. And so as a result, our data sort of becomes a little bit more muddled, and we really miss out on critical insights that are, we argue, very essential for developing targeted prevention and intervention strategies as well. Another common issue that I think we see a lot in the landscape of anti-trafficking efforts here in the US is that labor trafficking, unfortunately, oftentimes takes that backseat to sex trafficking. What I think we also argue is that this imbalance isn't necessarily incidental, but rather it stems from an interaction of some different societal factors, but also biases as well. And I think that we can probably agree that one of the more common biases that we encounter a lot is gender bias. So for example, sex trafficking is frequently perceived as a crime that predominantly affects women and girls. And so that sort of leads to a disproportionate focus on it. This perception is also, we argue, further influenced by this prevailing notion of a quote unquote ideal victim, which is one that is a little bit more likely to invoke public sympathy and mobilize resources. But we also know that a fundamental lack of understanding of labor trafficking and its complexities can also divert state and federal efforts so that they're only sort of focusing on addressing sex trafficking. And we unfortunately see this really across task forces, but also resource allocation and certainly public awareness campaigns that are often more heavily weighted towards addressing sex trafficking. And of course, I think we have to also acknowledge that political considerations also definitely play a role in all of this. Crimes of a sexual nature, I think, tend to carry more stigma and urgency, and so that sort of pushes them up on that political agenda. But again, as we acknowledge, there are so many nuances, and of course, I want to be clear that this prioritization is not, of course, uniform across our entire country, but it can certainly also vary quite drastically depending on, again, those cultural and social norms of different states and jurisdictions, for example. Another challenge is really the divergence among states and how they are defining and addressing the crime, sometimes even departing away from the TVPA language. And what we see is that these inconsistencies tend to lead to sometimes confusion in the identification of labor trafficking victims, but also the procedures needed to actually prosecute the traffickers themselves. As some other sort of researchers in this space have also argued that deficient state anti-trafficking laws have really sort of unfortunately created what we call a fragmented legal landscape, which has also sort of trickled down in a way that has resulted in things like regressive policing policies and the under-enforcement of labor trafficking laws. And really sort of compounding this issue is that labor trafficking crimes, and we'll talk about this in our findings as well, but they tend to often intersect with other types of crime as well. And so again, other researchers have noted that traditional policing methods are typically ill-equipped to address these intersections, especially with crimes that have only recently been legally defined like labor trafficking. And this lack of familiarity at the state level oftentimes means that officers, but certainly other law enforcing agencies and actors are oftentimes not adequately prepared to handle these kinds of cases. And as a result, as we know, investigations oftentimes will prioritize those other crimes, leaving that labor trafficking charge sort of under investigated and under prosecuted. And really the end result of that too is that this gap in state level enforcement then of course places quite a substantial burden on the federal system in the sense that that federal judiciary then oftentimes becomes that primary entity responsible for prosecuting these labor trafficking cases as well. Another sort of part, I guess, of what makes labor trafficking so challenging to tackle is really just the sheer variety of work environments where it can occur. I think oftentimes we think of industries like agriculture, construction, landscaping, healthcare, housekeeping as sort of these quote unquote hotspots for exploitation, and rightly so, because I think, these sectors have actually been quite well documented as common settings for labor trafficking. But the reality is that labor trafficking isn't always necessarily limited to just these fields. Even in industries that we, typically associate with sex trafficking, for example, massage parlors, strip clubs, and even cantinas, can certainly also become environments where labor trafficking happens. And we see that sort of nexus between sex and labor trafficking happening and sort of coexisting. And sort of adding to this complexity is also the relationship, of course, between labor rights policies, but also the diverse industries that they're supposed to protect. I think we can agree, right, that labor laws are really meant to, again, create those fair working conditions and practices, but they're not always adapted to really meet the unique needs of each sector. So for example, what's considered fair pay or acceptable working conditions in one industry might be completely different in another. And this lack of consistency, although we want to acknowledge can certainly be difficult to try to tackle, really leaves room for exploitation. And we see oftentimes labor traffickers taking advantage of these gaps in protection, really preying on workers who might not know about their rights, for example, or who are, too afraid to speak up due to fears of retaliation or even deportation and removal in some cases. The final one I want to talk about is pretty self-explanatory, and that's just inadequate training on the topic. I think I can tell you it's always really interesting to see how quickly people are, or how quick people are, I should say, to sort of gravitate towards learning about sex trafficking, and labor trafficking tends to sort of be, unfortunately, pushed to the side as well. And again, there's so many other issues, including misconceptions about, how labor trafficking isn't happening here in the United States. And so I think as an anti-trafficking community, we really need to make sure that we're sitting with those feelings and with those emotions, and having these courageous conversations to try to, navigate around them and come up with solutions together. And so all of this to say that even with all of these limitations discussed, it's still possible, and certainly indeed necessary, to contribute insights through research. And this really brings us to the focus of this paper, which was an exploratory study really designed to examine the characteristics and methods of labor traffickers over an 11-year period between 2011 and 2022 here in the United States. And so as such, our research really sought to address the three following questions. One, what are the general demographic characteristics of labor traffickers in the United States? Two, what are the means of control and recruitment used by labor traffickers here in the country? And finally, what trends exist in disposition outcomes for labor trafficking cases here in the United States? And so our methodology for approaching these questions was really structured in two key phases. The first included conducting a structured online search where we used targeted keywords related to labor trafficking, and they covered sort of various aspects of the issue. So things like child labor, forced labor, labor exploitation, but also other immigration-related offenses like immigration fraud, visa fraud, and migrant workers, for example. But the goal really was to identify individuals who had been arrested for offenses related to labor trafficking. And so once we collected that initial information, each search result was then screened to ensure that only relevant cases, of course, were specifically tied to labor trafficking were being included in our analysis. That second part of our approach included gathering secondary or supplementary information from open source resources and additional research databases. So things like Bloomberg Law, LexisNexis, and Casetext. And what we did is we were able to search for the names of these labor traffickers, and also using other identifying details of them to really collect sort of a broader range of data related to these cases. And I can tell you that that was very, very helpful, although not necessarily perfect in terms of giving us the data for that third question, which revolved around disposition outcomes. A couple other things to note is that after we had collected all that data, we used a really nerdy data analysis software called SPSS, where we organized, we cleaned, and we analyzed the data. And finally, in true research fashion, I also want to make sure that we're clearly acknowledging our study's limitations. We know, of course, that this reliance on publicly available data really constrains the scope and depth of our findings because of obvious reasons, right? Public data sources may not always necessarily capture that full extent of labor trafficking activities, or even provide detailed information on all relevant cases as well. But now we're going to kind of dive into some of the findings that emerged that relate to those questions. So when we talk about labor trafficker demographics, the majority that we found in this sample of 283 offenders over that 11-year period was that the majority were actually identified as male. As you can see, 64% of the total sample, which was about 181 cases. When we looked at age, as you can see, this age of the traffickers at the time of arrest varied quite widely, spanning all the way from 19 up to 80 years old, with an average of about 42 and a half years old. And what we sort of can, kind of hypothesize is that broad age range really suggests that labor trafficking is perpetuated by individuals really across a wide spectrum of life stages. When we also looked at racial composition, which I think sometimes for folks is when we talk about demographics, probably where a lot of our minds go. I can tell you that unfortunately, detailed information of that racial composition of the labor traffickers was unavailable because none of those sources that we access, including news media and federal reports, really explicitly provided that data. And I can also tell you that we, very intentionally avoided making assumptions about individuals' racial and ethnic composition by for example, just looking at their mugshot, always trying to make sure that we're, following ethical guidelines in our research. But then finally, when we looked at country of origin, which was absolutely explicitly named in many of these cases, we actually found that labor traffickers come from a diverse array of countries. So places like Bangladesh, China, Cuba, Guatemala, Indonesia, Italy, Micronesia, Pakistan, Ukraine, the list kind of goes on and on and on. But we actually were only able to find country of origin status for 133, so about almost half of our total sample. But what we did find among those 133 traffickers of whom we had that documented information on their country of origin, 63%, so more than half, were actually not originally from the United States, while we saw about 36.9%, about 50 cases where the traffickers were actually US nationals. And so this is, of course, quite an interesting find. So we will definitely make sure that we unpack that a little bit later on in the presentation. So let's kind of dive into the operational methods and job sectors where labor traffickers were active here in the United States during that period. As you can see, of these traffickers, 66.4% operated on their own. And so they, in these cases, they weren't linked to any businesses or company, but rather they engage in exploitation independently. On the other hand, we saw about 1 out of 3, so 33% of all cases where the traffickers involved labor trafficking activities through a company. And so what we mean when we say company is we're really talking about instances where traffickers were connected to a business, either as employees or as owners, and then use that business to exploit their victims. What we also learned was that these traffickers always, didn't just stick to just one type of work. Oftentimes they exploited their victims across a variety of job sectors. Some of these included agriculture, restaurants, home health care, construction, but we also saw drug and contraband operations, to name a few. And so what was really interesting about that drug and contraband operations was that it actually extended beyond this concept of forced criminality, where, for example, victims were forced or coerced into selling substances as a means of bringing in additional money. But we actually saw several cases where individuals were being forced or coerced to cultivate marijuana farms as well. But of course, it didn't just stop there. And actually 14 of the cases that we saw, traffickers were exploiting victims across multiple job sectors concurrently at the same time. For example, some individuals were trafficked in both a restaurant and a hair salon, while others had that clear involvement of both sex and labor trafficking. So things like, exchanging sex for something of value while also working as a housekeeper came up in these cases. And of course, we also found that some traffickers force or coerce victims through less common contexts. We saw some cases of credit card fraud schemes, and even one case where, unfortunately, a victim was coerced and forced to serve as a surrogate mother for their trafficker as well. And so when it came to the recruitment strategies used by labor traffickers, as you can see, they varied quite significantly across cases. What I can tell you is that the most common method was offering housing or shelter accommodation, which we saw in about 65% of all cases. We also saw other things like promises of monetary gain and wealth, false promises of job opportunities, debt bondage. We also saw, of course, direct threats being made against victims or somebody that that person cares about. So, for example, the victims' families. And then finally, we also saw staffing agencies, which were involved in about 17% of cases, or 50 instances to be more precise, where these agencies were really utilized to recruit victims, again, under that pretense of legitimate employment. I'll also add too, is that we saw about 20% of cases, 59 actually in total, where the traffickers initially engaged in smuggling operations that later escalated into labor trafficking situations as well. Before we kind of go on to that next slide, I want to also note that many traffickers did not rely on just one method. So multiple recruitment tactics were oftentimes used in combination, and so that led to, of course, some overlap in these percentages as well. When we examine the control methods that were used by labor traffickers, starting with the most common tactics, we of course saw psychological violence, of course, where traffickers were employing manipulation tactics to, of course, maintain control over the situation. We also saw other things like managing the living space, having complete financial control where victims were denied access to their earnings. We heard a lot and read a lot about general restrictions of self-autonomy, actually quite commonly in about almost 70% of cases. And then we saw other things like physical assault happening in almost 50%. And then some other interesting findings were we saw withholding passports and visas was another tactic observed in about 40% of traffickers or cases. And then we also saw threats being made to report victims to immigration for removal or deportation, also quite similarly in about 40% of those cases. We also saw other things like sexual assault, starvation, and again, sort of these blanket threats towards victims and or their families to sort of ultimately enforce compliance. And of course, very similar to the recruitment strategies on that previous slide, I want to note that many traffickers did not just rely on one method. And so multiple control activities were oftentimes used in combination, again, leading to some overlap in these percentages as well. Before we dive into sort of the geographic location of arrests, I also want to emphasize that this is not an exhaustive capture of every single labor trafficking case over the 11 years. Certainly, while we tried to locate as many as we could, we also want to acknowledge that there were cases that we did not come across for a variety of reasons. But that said, among those 283 cases that we did analyze, the states with the highest numbers of arrests were Texas, California, and Georgia. I'll also note that these three states were home to some of the largest labor trafficking operations, some even happening just a few years ago, really each involving significant numbers of traffickers. So if you heard about Operation Blooming Onion, for example, that is just, again, an example of why some of these numbers are quite dense. But other states with notable arrest numbers, of course, included New York, Florida, and Illinois. Okay. And so shifting gear just a little bit, let's talk about really the types of crimes for which the traffickers in our study were charged or convicted. In order for us to do this, we actually categorize these crimes based on established legal classifications and typologies, covering sort of a range of offenses, as you can see, including white-collar crime, organized crime, immigration-related offenses, just to name a few. But the data actually revealed that the majority of traffickers were charged with labor trafficking and immigration-related offenses. Specifically, we saw in about 77.7% of all traffickers, or about 220 people, that they were actually being charged with labor trafficking. But however, of that big number, we actually only saw 24%, or about 70 individuals, who were actually then convicted of those labor trafficking-related crimes. And so you might be wondering, right? Shouldn't the number of labor trafficking charges be 100%? Not necessarily. I can tell you that in an effort to really provide a more comprehensive look at labor trafficking networks, we actually also included individuals who were arrested on different charges, but were still certainly involved in the labor trafficking case. We saw a lot of this actually with some of the larger nail salon cases where some folks were arrested because they were the ones overseeing the books, so to speak. But absolutely, we're sort of inadvertently contributing to the labor trafficking situation as well. As I mentioned earlier, We saw almost 1 out of 4 of these traffickers, or about 112, were charged with immigration-related offenses. And unfortunately, only about 67 of those individuals, so a little less than half, were convicted of those immigration-related crimes. And so what I really want to draw your attention to here with this analysis is, again, that discrepancy between the number of charges and actual convictions in labor trafficking cases, as well as, again, that significant proportion of traffickers charged with immigration-related offenses, which, again, we'll unpack here on the next slide. Okay, so I know what you're thinking, right? What does this all mean? I didn't know I was going to come and sit in on a class and learn about some very interesting research. But we always want to make sure that we're being intentional in terms of using this information to sort of inform how we move forward. And so one of the key takeaways from the study, of course, is this urgent need for better data collection methods, specifically targeting labor trafficking trends here in the United States. Of course, this suggests that we really need to shift our approach to labor trafficking, moving beyond those traditional methods that have really dominated since the passage of the TVPA into the year 2000. For example, as I'm sure many of us can acknowledge, for years, anti-trafficking efforts here in our country really have primarily centered on that criminal justice approach, where law enforcement really has been sort of at that forefront, leading investigations, identifying victims. And while this strategy has had some successes, particularly in the sex trafficking arena, it has, as we can see by the numbers, proven just a little bit inadequate for addressing the complexities of labor trafficking cases. And so that criminal justice approach, as we know, tends to really focus, again, on prosecuting traffickers, recovering victims, but it oftentimes falls short, actually, in preventing trafficking from occurring in the first place, or even addressing, again, those systemic issues that make individuals vulnerable to exploitation. And so in response to these limitations, some community-led initiatives actually across our country have actually begun to emphasize a different strategy, which is one that focuses a bit more on workers' rights. This approach also prioritizes things like education, fair labor practices, robust labor laws. But while I think this method is absolutely valuable in empowering workers and preventing some forms of exploitation, it often overlooks the need to directly address and deter the actual perpetrators of the crime as well. And so given these limitations, there's really a growing need I should say a growing recognition of the need for a new model, one that really combines the strengths of both that criminal justice and that worker rights approach into sort of a comprehensive, holistic strategy. And so if you've been involved in the anti-trafficking space for some time, you might have heard, especially from our federal partners here on the call, this public health approach to combating trafficking. And so we argue, of course, that this model really offers that promising framework that aligns, again, with the need for a more integrated strategy as well. As you learned, the study also highlighted really that disproportionately high percentage of labor trafficking offenders who were foreign nationals, about 63% of traffickers of whom we had that documented country of origin status. What we argue is that this might indicate sort of what we call a calculated exploitation of cultural and communal vulnerabilities. So traffickers who oftentimes share that cultural or national background with their victims most likely have that awareness of the specific social, economic, and legal weaknesses within those communities, which of course they then exploit. Theoretically, of course, these traffickers may use things like language barriers, fears related to immigration status, and also limited economic mobility prevalent in many immigrant countries to their advantage. But again, I also think this really speaks to the importance of that public health approach. And I think, again, as we move forward, we really need to ensure that we're no longer using that one-size-fits-all model, and that our attempts at prevention and intervention are also being proposed in a way that really makes sense for different individuals and for different groups and communities. When we talk about future research directions, obviously, we want to encourage that we move beyond just those mere prevalence estimates and really engage in the realities of some of these cases. For example, as we learned in our study, there was a need clearly to really research that intersection of cultural affiliation and trafficking methodologies as well. And there's a lot to be said in terms of how we can start doing that as well. Of course, as you saw, there were really some quite significant disparities in sentencing outcomes, which really ultimately reflect inconsistencies in how labor trafficking is being legally defined and prosecuted across these different jurisdictions. All this to say, of course, that we really call for increased attention from law and policymakers to revisit some of these statutes and to really seek to collaborate with survivors and allied professionals to co-create laws, of course, that more accurately capture the nuances in labor trafficking cases as well. So Now, I know that was a ton of information. Again, I know you're probably wondering, okay, what can we do with it other than what we just went through? And so I want to talk just very briefly about our Arizona Labor Trafficking Outreach Project, or Project Alto. Sort of quick backstory on it before we lead into the panel with some of our wonderful partners and friends and colleagues, is that Project Alto actually started back in 2021 by a really good friend and colleague by the name of Bandak Lowell. And it sort of really came to reality because of this recognition of all of these different sort of issues and barriers that we just spent, the last, 40 minutes talking about. And so what we realized, that at least what we were aware of in our state of Arizona, was that nobody else was really doing proactive and preventative outreach to communities and groups which we might perceive to be at that increased risk for labor exploitation and trafficking. And so really what we're doing is, again, it's a street outreach model that prioritizes that worker rights approach just because that's what's most appropriate in the context. And I'm also very happy to share with you all that we now have grown Alto to include over 10 different social service providers, but also a combination of other local, state, and federal agencies as well. And so who we're actually conducting outreach to, as I mentioned, we launched Alto back in 2021, but we actually took about a year hiatus, about a year and a half into, and then relaunched it back in April of 2023. And so since our relaunch, we've really been focusing on day laborers. You've probably seen and interacted with these workers. They typically wait at places like Home Depot, Walmart, different gas stations. But as you can see, we've actually, in just that past year and some change, we've interacted with 560 day laborers, really just around our Maricopa County. And of those, we actually had almost 60%, so close to 300 day laborers actually agree to complete our survey, which is actually fantastic for us in terms of numbers. And so you can kind of look, when we talk about day laborers here in Arizona, the age varies quite drastically, 16 all the way to 75, overwhelmingly male, but also, as you can see, country of origin, overwhelming presence of folks from Mexico, followed by other, Spanish-speaking and Latin American countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, the list kind of goes on and on. What we also learned from the street outreach with day laborers, because we also do a survey that takes about 5 or 10 minutes, and we share this data, we offer it to our partners, really with the idea that they can then use this information to apply for future grants that, again, target that labor trafficking, that labor exploitation piece. But what we learned among those that completed the survey, the 296, was almost half shared with us that they worked for no pay or almost no pay. 30% shared that they were misled into doing work that was different from what they were originally told they were going to do. 28% shared that they were forced to work extremely long hours for little or no pay. 22% shared that they were forced to work in an unsafe environment, and almost a little over 1 out of 10 shared that they were threatened, harmed, or intimidated at work. So again, our hope with Alto really is that this can prove or serve that doing outreach that focuses on labor trafficking and labor exploitation isn't as difficult as we might oftentimes think it is. I think as we talk about Alto with different task forces, that seems to be the worry of, like, we've really historically allocated so many of our resources into sex trafficking. How do we even get started? And so this is actually a plug for us. We're happy to meet with you all. We'll include the slides at the end. Emily will send those out. We have our contact information on there, and we are very, very happy to meet with folks and talk about the logistics of the work that we do, so that if this is something you want to replicate in your own communities, absolutely, we want to support it. So without further ado, I actually want to, again, shift gear and reintroduce my co-presenter and friend, Dominique.
Hi. Thank you very much. We're really excited to talk to you about our Project Alto. When Bandak Lowell created it, he was here at STIR, and we're really encouraged that we can try new things and make mistakes and try to make sure that we get messages to people who need it in our community. So we're quite pleased with ourselves. And I think the best highlight is the people who have agreed to be on this panel with us are trusted partners, trusted friends. And every time we do an outreach, we do something called iterative evaluation, and we ask, what could we do better? How could we do this better? Are we reaching the right people? Where should we go? What should we do? And each of these folks are just great partners and very thoughtful in their approach. So I'm going to go right into the panel. You have all of their backgrounds. I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to ask it to Valentina. The first question is, Valentina, what aspect of labor, trafficking, and exploitation victims' experiences does your agency address? So what aspects of both labor trafficking and exploitation does Always serve?
So much, Dominique. We provide, and thanks, Zeke, amazing presentation. I'm always so inspired by you, and just thank you for everything you do. We provide free legal and social services to survivors of trafficking of all ages. We use the term survivors or victims, depending on, you know, what each individual prefers. And our immigration services include T visas. I imagine people know about T visas. They're for survivors of sex and or labor trafficking. And then U visas are for survivors of crimes. And sometimes, you know, you're doing the analysis of whether a T or a U makes more sense in these situations. We also provide family law services. Many trafficking survivors also need help with divorce and child support and things like that. And then also criminal history repair, because sometimes when you're trafficked, you need assistance cleaning up your record.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to send that question next to Emma Wells from the Florence Project.
Hi, Dominique. Thank you so much. And thank you, Zeke. We're super happy to be here. So we're at the Florence Project. The Florence Project is a nonprofit that historically helps and provides legal services to detained folks, both children and adults. I'm in the adult program, and I lead a group that specifically works for trafficking individuals that are either detained in immigration detention centers or they are not detained. So I am not limited to that. So it's a new program, which we're very excited about, that we don't have to be just in the detention centers. We can be outside of it. So we focus on trafficking as T visas. We really work with anyone who has been a victim or a survivor of trafficking. One thing that is really special about our program is because we have we focus on removal defense, so people who are detained, is that we have been really immersing ourselves in the detained world, working with ICE and HSI and trying to help those who may have been victims and are detained that should not be, who have either been trafficked across the border or may have had interior enforcement and have been in a labor trafficking situation and then get picked up because of it. And then because of our expertise, we're working on that, maybe also with the new rules and talking to HSI, talking to ICE or ERO to get them out of detention and then continue with getting them the services they need, connecting with the community, with ASU, with all of our other partners, making sure they're getting the assistance they need, and then continuing on with their immigration related needs and focusing on getting their removal taken care of. So those are their removal proceedings, as well as their affirmative release, which would be the trafficking or working with HSI to get them maybe continued presence, whatever else they need on the trafficking end.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next question goes to our friend Lilian Vasquez Cordova from the Mexican Consulate. You're muted, Lilian.
I'm sorry. Hello,
Great.
everybody. Thank you, Dominique, for inviting us to participate. We're very, very interesting study. We're happy to be learning from the work of ASU. So I work for the Mexican Consulate previously in Arizona, and that's how I related to Alto. But for those of you that are not too familiar with the area of the consulate that I head is the protection department. Most commonly, we are not related, we're not identified as a common service of the consulates. But in our department, we have several areas that are directed to provide assistance to Mexican nationals abroad. And one of those areas is labor rights. And in terms of labor exploitation and trafficking victims, we often deal with cases of just all across the spectrum that Zeke mentioned at the beginning, from the gray area to the trafficking cases. The most common ones that we receive are wage theft and discrimination or harassment at work. We are supposed to be a resource center for these workers and be able to refer them to the different agencies and also accompany that process with them. And we have legal programs at their service too, when whether it is immigration or labor related, but we can provide orientation, whether it is a free consultation or even representation in some cases. We often work with other members of the Alto project to provide assistance to victims. It can be in the form of a lawyer that we can allocate resources for, or direct resources for the victims that for basic needs, immediate needs like food, clothing, transportation, and also to get their documents back when they have been taken from them.
Thank you so much, Lillian. Our last panelist, Alicia Winchell from the International Rescue Committee. Same question.
Perfect. Thanks, Dominique, and thanks, Zeke, for presenting. Appreciate you guys having us on this panel. Yeah, like Dominique said, I work for the International Rescue Committee, which is a global humanitarian organization and more widely in the US known for refugees resettlement. So trafficking is just a little piece of what our organization does. And there's only in a couple offices across the US as well, but we are able to offer it here in Arizona in both our Phoenix and Tucson offices, and we provide comprehensive case management services to all victims of trafficking, regardless of age, regardless of whether it was sex or labor trafficking, regardless of gender. But our niche, just because we work for an organization that works primarily with refugees, is working with foreign national victims. So we provide mostly assistance with getting connected to legal, so working with wonderful people like Lillian and with Emma and with Valentina, so that those clients can get access to things like T visas and U visas. But I like to say whatever a client needs and comes to us with, we get them connected to those resources. So a lot of times our clients need medical care, they need help getting connected to mental health services, English classes, safe housing. We really try to do it all. We provide financial assistance as well. And so again, whatever needs clients have, we really try to meet that need through our amazing community partners and what we can provide in-house as well.
So I think it's really special that we are able to provide this in a parking lot where people are really sometimes at their most vulnerable. And so I think all of those things, when someone's sitting across from you in a desk is one thing, but when we're trying to reach out and educate people about the things they know or don't know about their rights here, especially about labor exploitation and labor trafficking, I think it gets more complicated. So Lisa, I'm going to ask you, the next question is, how do you see the IRC and your role at these Alto events, which are about once a month in parking lots of Circle K's, of Home Depots, of places where we've researched and tried to find through tips where day laborers may be, and then asking them questions to learn about their experience so we can better serve them. So how do you see the IRC fitting into the Alto work?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had the pleasure of being around since the first Alto event and have been through some of the rough patches of it. And so I'm glad that we've been able to do that. But definitely, again, because we work with foreign national victims, I think it's really important for us to be a part of this work, because as Zeke showed in that in his presentation, most of the people, I think if not all of the people that we're encountering in those Alto events are foreign nationals. And as Zeke said, most of the dialogue is around sex trafficking. And so really bringing the dialogue and the conversation to labor trafficking and making clients aware of that spectrum of when they might be experiencing labor exploitation or labor trafficking, and being aware of the resources that we can provide to them. I think it can be so overwhelming to be somebody that is a foreign national in a new city or in a new state, new country, and not be aware of the local resources that are available to them. And I don't think many are aware that there are those resources available to them, given that they may not have status. And so I think it's super important that we're there just so we can kind of shed light. And if we encounter somebody that could be served through one of our programs, we can immediately get them into services with us, or if we have a wait list, get them onto a wait list with us and hopefully get those clients' needs met.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask that same question to Lillian from the Mexican Consulate. How do you see the Mexican Consulate engaging with Alto? How do you see your role there? We've been out in parking lots together, and you've been really consistent. We miss you in Arizona, but thank you for continuing to pass this on. But what do you think?
Yeah, no, I miss you too, guys, and I hope that it can extend. Events like this can take place in other areas. And as Alicia was mentioning, we went through some rough patches when we started these events. And one of those was one time where we identified when we were there as staff from the Mexican consulate. And that changed, if you remember, the dynamics of the whole thing, because it shifted the focus to those services that are most commonly known from the consulate. People started asking about passports and what the requirements were and all that. And at a certain point, we also experienced some rejection or some refusal to talk to us about their experiences. And I think that's a very common barrier that we government agencies experience, or government representative experience, because people are not very willing to trust because of past experiences, because of fear, since they are in the country unauthorized, without documents. They are very reluctant to talk to someone that identifies as a government official. But then when we go out on these events with other organizations, with non-government organizations, when we meet them at the places where they commonly gather, and we bring more resources than just the ones that one agency can provide, it's very valuable, and it breaks a barrier, an important barrier, because it creates or starts creating that trust. And they little by little start talking more, learning more about, I think the prevention importance of these events, component of these events is vital for our efforts to educate workers on their rights. So it's definitely a very valuable tool for the consulate to go meet workers and possible victims at the places where they already gather, instead of expecting them to come to an office and beat all of those fears that they have about coming forward.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next, the same question to Emma Wells from the Florence Project. How do you see your agency fitting into the Alto project and the events that we run?
Well, as I said, this grant that we had to start trafficking was actually very new. So going out with Alto was not just something that we want to do with Alto, but it was also a way to get out our name for our grant and make sure that the Florence Project wasn't just known for being detention centers, but we also wanted to be known in the community. So with going out, assisting in the community, I thought was really important, not only to go out and help, but for us to be like, hey, we're here to help you. And as like the Mexican consulate said, like when I'm out there, one thing that I would do is I didn't just want to go and ask questions. I would say, soy abogada. The minute I would say I'm an attorney, changes the dynamic, would change who I am, and right away I could get people to talk to me more. So I really found that just saying that it would change how I would get the reactions. I'd get more information. I could get more what's going on. And it's so important to really get the engagement, to get them. In the minute I can say, soy abogada, oh my God, the information starts flowing, the crowds start coming, because they want to hear more. Like, oh, I can tell you this, I can tell you that. There's a different little level of interaction that goes on. And it's incredible just seeing what else is happening, what else you will learn from what is occurring in that area, just when you're there. And you have to be there to see it. And it's constantly happening. And then being able to then provide that information to let them know, because no one is going to say, I'm getting trafficked. It's a very legal term. This is what's happening to you. Providing that information, saying, this is what's going on with you. This isn't right. here is what we can do, not just legally, but these are resources. These are people here who are here to help you. Just even if the ones that don't want to speak, that are hanging around and listening, it's a way to provide it there. So while we may or may not get clients or anything, the information is powerful and impactful. I thought all of those gatherings, every time that we go out, it's going to make an impact on the community. And us being there too is great. It was thought was a great benefit to the Florence Project to say that we're also a member of that community and we're here to help.
Fantastic. All right, finally, Valentina, how do you see Always fitting into the Alto project? How does that look for you?
Of course, so we're really grateful to be a part of it, and largely our representation is through our bilingual, bicultural, trauma-informed social worker, and she really, I think some people have kind of touched on this, but it's education, allowing people to get to a point, meeting them where they're at in various ways, right? Is meeting them in community where they are, meeting them where they are in terms of their understanding of what they're doing, right? Like Emma said, people think they're working. Not everyone, but many people think, oh, this is what a job is, and this is how it is, and this is my option, and kind of being with people and educating them without pushing them as to what their rights are and what might be going on and how the law might define that, I think is super important, and kind of sitting with them through that. I think also being there in partnership with other organizations helps lend legitimacy to all of the organizations, right? I think people are skeptical, understandably so, of organizations saying, we want to offer you free services. And so when you're there all together, it's, oh, okay, well, they must be legit because these people aren't calling them out. And then I also, you know, I mean, these are early Saturday morning events. And I'm not saying, you know, day laborers should be grateful or anything, but what Graciela has reported back to me is that they kind of recognize, hey, you're out here on a Saturday morning, right? You're giving up your Saturday morning to be out here to talk to people who might not want to talk to you. And we've seen, you know, a lot of instances of exploitation and trafficking, and like Zeke said, people being told they're going to be paid something and not being paid that. Even people who have been stranded at job sites, not given transportation back, and yeah, just the isolation behind trafficking, kind of trying to eliminate that barrier.
Beautifully said. Thank you, my friend. Next question. This goes to Licia. How do you think, what do you think are the most important aspects of the work that we do out on the Alto outreach events? What are sort of the key components that you think are the most important?
Yeah, great question. I think personally, I think I kind of mentioned this in my last answer too, but it really that education piece, I think being out there and talking to them and just learning about their experiences, but kind of seeing where they fall on the spectrum and allowing them to kind of understand where they fall on the spectrum too. Because again, coming from other countries, they're may not likely unaware of the labor rights that exist and the laws that exist and the rights that they have, and so educating them what labor exploitation is and what labor trafficking is, and then making them aware of the resources that are available to them. I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but we give out a little shoe card that has phone numbers and names of all of the different agencies that they can contact in the community. And so being able to give that to them in a form where they can keep it in their pocket or keep it in their shoe and contact them if they encounter anything down the line or have encountered anything that they weren't willing to share when we meet with them. I personally think that's the most important piece, is that education piece, and then being able to talk about it, the Alto event themselves on forums like this, so that we can get that education out further, because it's not just happening at these Phoenix Home Depots, right? It's happening everywhere. And I think that's most important, is the education for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. How about Lillian? What do you think are the most important aspects of the Alto events? What are the big takeaways that you have had from them?
Well, I think, as Alicia mentioned, the education part is key, but also the fact that it's a a multi-agency effort. The fact that we go in group as a unit, but that can provide very different services, like kind of like a one-stop shop when we go and meet these workers. If it is that they have lost their documents, then there is somebody from the consulate, or that their documents were retained by the employer. There is a consulate that can help them with them. But then there is lawyers that can see about the possibility of them getting to adjust their status, or to get a T or a U visa. And then I remember there was a time where we also had the mental health or health component too. So that part that we are able to provide different services from different agencies is in one event is very valuable. And as I said before, the fact that we're meeting them where they are, it's very, very important, because we are creating that bridge of trust with workers to come forward.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go to Emma. Can you describe a little bit of what the experience might be like out there, and what kind of information and what kind of interaction that you're having with the clients that we're seeking to work with out there? So what's it like to go do an Alto event?
Usually hot. There's a time of year, but I think it varies in whether we've been there before. So sometimes the word gets out that and that could be not the best thing. So unfortunately, sometimes there's traffickers that are involved. So if the word gets out, we may not have people who want to speak to us initially. And then once you can get into a group, you'll have the people who will talk. Again, that's why you use what you can to build a trust, which is why I will always say I'm an attorney. That will get people talking to me. So if I can get people saying I'm an attorney, we're just here to ask questions, start going through, I can get started to people asking. The attorney part always works for me. And I'm like, oh, really? Why are you here? I was like, we're just here to ask questions. We want to know about how you've been treated. You can start to get at least one going, and maybe a friend will hang around. Like I said, the attorney part usually works, and I will usually get a group. And from that group, I'll start hearing how long people will be here. Depending on the area, I've had people who are very new. I have only a few months have been working, trying to work, maybe not getting paid much to very little, to those who've been here for a long time. But usually the experience is around the same, where they've had not been treated well, have had varied experiences of whether or not they've collected funds, haven't collected funds, may or may not have had agreements that did not go the way they expected to be agreed upon. Some who have had experience where like, well, can I tell you about it later? Some who've wanted to maybe walk away from the group to talk about experience. So if I've had like one of my staff attorneys with, they'll be like, oh, well, she's also an attorney. They're like, okay, well, I'll go talk to her about a particular experience. And then I stay with the group, and they want general information about what their rights are. They want to know, oh, well, can I do something about the person who didn't pay? So there'll be a lot of questions about labor rights in general. So that'll be very common, like, what can I do about this? So I find a lot of it is, just, well, isn't this just normal? Isn't it normal treatment? Yeah. This isn't how it should be. So it is more the education, but I think one of the important pieces every time is that we're there. It's the presence. It is just definitely the presence. And I think that's what's important about it, is that where people show up and people are there.
Right. So in closing from this panel, we wear a label t-shirt that says Alto on it. We bring with us food and cold water. snacks, information to hand out from each agency, and we make sure that we stick together. We're watching out for safety, and there's a ton we've learned from each time we go out. We try to take that information and integrate it and do better the next time, and have other pieces of information we've learned about how people get to the site where we're engaging with them. Oftentimes they have to pay someone to get them there. It used to be a couple dollars. Now there's a percentage being required for that transportation. And so we learn more and more about what people need and how we can be of assistance. So on that note, I'm going to close our part of the presentation, and I'm going to thank you all so much for listening. And we're really excited about this work, and we hope that other cities and other communities are going to think about how they can work with their day laborers who are incredibly vulnerable. And I'd like to introduce Rafael Bautista, who serves as the Vice Chair of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for the introduction. What a great panel! So much good information you guys share. For this panel, this is a federal resource panel. We're gonna do a case example. I'm gonna jump into reading the case. We are a little behind on the schedule, and I'm gonna let the panelists introduce themselves when they want to answer the question. So the case study will read like this. Upon arriving in the United States, Joe was kept in isolation by his employer. He was given a place to sleep in the basement and told not to speak to anyone, or he will be turned into immigration services. He was forced to do the housekeeping work that he was hired to do, but he was never paid for his work. He was also forced to drive farm workers to work. He felt that he had no one to turn to help for. Joe and the farm workers liked to stop at the truck stop for coffee. One day, after stopping for coffee, he got pulled over by the highway patrol. He was arrested and charged with human smuggling. After hearing Joe's story, the public defender assigned to his case suspected that Joe is a victim of labor trafficking and contacted Homeland Security investigations at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So one of the following questions, and I'm going to let the panelists choose who wants to answer first. What services and public assistance could you offer to Joe?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Calloway. I'm the Victim Assistance Program Specialist for the HSI office in SAC San Francisco. The referral for assistance benefits would depend on a number of things happening before referring to me. One, that the HSI office has assigned a case agent. The case agent has probably already had a conversation with the defense attorney. They've likely had an interview with Joe to determine that the forceful or coercion elements of labor trafficking exists. Because of the arrest, there may be some discussion with either the local or federal agency that made the arrest to learn more about the case and maybe build the case for labor trafficking. There's also likely some consultation with the AUSA to determine if the AUSA is going to prosecute the case, or a determination if a local DA is going to take the case. So a lot of determinations, things are happening behind the scenes. But once a determination that human trafficking has happened, the HSI officer makes a referral to me. One of my first goals is to make a referral to one of the Trafficking and Crime Victims Assistance Program funded agencies, like the IRC, the International Rescue Committee. In the event that the IRC lacks capacity to accept Joe for the time being, my role is to help him apply for those state trafficking crime victims assistance benefits, like the Med-Cal, the CalFresh, the CAS assistance. So the way that works is he would apply for the benefits the same as anyone else, but there's a state provision that allows human trafficking victims to apply for benefits by adding to that application 2 additional documents that are supporting evidence. So for us, we typically use a statement or a declaration statement signed by the victim that I'm a victim of human trafficking and that I intend to apply for a T visa. The other statement can come from an NGO like the IRC. And it says the same thing, that this is a victim of, Joe is a victim of human trafficking and that Joe intends to apply for a T visa. It takes about 45 days or so for those benefits to get processed, and it's cash and resource dependent. And so once the benefits office makes a determination, he can access those benefits. We'd also be making a referral to a housing program based on his age. The scenario doesn't say how old he is, and so we do an assessment to determine if Huckleberry House is an option, or Larkin Street Youth is an option, or even Ruby's Place. So we're going to assess to determine what his age is and then make a referral to the appropriate housing agency. And then lastly, we'll also help with the California Victims Compensation Board benefit. We'll do the basic benefit, and then because he's also been determined to be a victim of labor trafficking, we'd also assist with the wage compensation benefit. That California Victims Compensation application, that more specifically the wage benefit, could help him recover up to $10,000 a year for up to 2 years of labor exploitation. All of those calculations are determined by the number of hours worked per day and the number of months worked. CalVCB calculates those things behind the scenes, and then based on their calculations, they issue a check for the amount of wages that were lost through exploitation. The only caveat being, in the event that any sort of restitution is given for the same case, if it's financial, then any amount that exceeds the amount that CalVCB had already paid out would need to be paid back to CalVCB, so that there's not double dipping.
Hi, this is Monica Rousey, and I'm with ACF and the Office on Trafficking in Persons. And I would just like to add on to what Michael just mentioned, some of the benefits that OTIP is what we're called by acronyms. What OTIP is able to offer. And we can offer, since in this case scenario, it's an adult, we can offer what they call a certification letter. And that letter would be used to obtain a number of benefits. And it could be used for food benefits like SNAP. And most of you are probably familiar with that. And that's one of the programs that you can purchase food as if you were using cash at most grocery stores, but it is a benefit that they may qualify for. They could also possibly qualify for what we call refugee cash assistance. And it would be the same as what a refugee would get. And it is a temporary cash amount for up to 8 months following the date that the benefits would start. They would also be eligible for health benefits, medical insurance, so they would be entitled to utilize those benefits at hospitals or clinics. They could also receive mental health as well, and they could also apply for what we call FAFSA, right? And that's to get help with paying for higher education. And there's a few other benefits that come along with that as well, which is like housing, where they may qualify for some type of public housing assistance, and also with employment. And that would be through a refugee support service. And a lot of times these programs, we work in coordination with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, and just seeing which way would be the best way to make sure that the victim or survivor are able to access these types of benefits. And I will turn it back over to.
I can take it. I can take it, Monica.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so Maureen French, I use she, they pronouns. I am from the United States Attorney's Office Victim Witness Unit. And as Michael Calloway mentioned, there would be a discussion with the case agent to bring it to the United States Attorney's Office or to the District Attorney's Office. And he mentioned the AUSA, which is the Assistant United States Attorney. And so if that case was brought and found to meet the federal criteria, then the Assistant United States Attorney would charge the case federally. And then that is when a victim specialist would be assigned to the case, and they would reach out to the survivor, to Joe, and to provide an introduction and support to what is about to happen, explaining what the criminal justice system means to them and how they can expect the case to move forward. The victim specialist would be the point of contact for communication about the case, and also communication to have with the prosecutor. The victim specialist would go over what the Crime Victims' Rights Act is to this survivor and make sure that they understand the different places where they can enact those rights. And the victim specialist would assist them in doing so when the victim or survivor chooses to do so. We would also do a needs assessment similar to what Michael and Monica spoke about. It's all about meeting the person's needs, whatever is needed. We will refer to resources. As we know, trauma can affect us in different ways. So sometimes they're open to resources at certain times, but other times they're not. And so just checking in, making sure that they are aware of the different resources and services that are out there for them. If they present as LGBTQ, if they present with any physical disability or anything like that, we would definitely find services that specialize in those areas to be able to provide that to the survivor. We would walk with the person, providing emotional support if the survivor was asked to testify in a grand jury appearance. We would put them in what's called the National Victim Notification System, which allows us to notify victims of any public court proceeding. And we would provide emotional support and court accompaniment to that survivor if they chose to come to the hearings. Otherwise, we would provide updates, attend the hearings and provide updates to the survivor. We would inform them if the case was going into plea negotiations. And these are all aligning with the Crime Victims' Rights Act. And so before a plea negotiation is met, the victim specialist will inform the survivor, letting them know of what to expect, asking what their feedback is on that particular, potential plea negotiation. And of course, that would be either communicated directly to the assistant U.S. attorney, to the prosecutor, or to the victim specialist and shared with the prosecutor. If the case went to trial, we would provide court accompaniment support for that. If they so happen to be a witness, most likely they would. We would make sure that they felt extremely supported and provide much preparation so that they can minimize their re-traumatization going through that process. Post-conviction, we would provide support in the sentencing phase of the case, which includes filling out the victim impact statement. There's a written statement, and then also speaking to the court at the date of sentencing, providing them with, letting them know what to expect in that hearing as well. In addition, there's also a right to restitution, and Michael Calloway also mentioned about that. We would assist in collecting documents. We would refer to the TVPA that was mentioned in the previous panel in terms of what could be asked for in the restitution phase. And of course, the prosecutor for the government would be intimately involved in that as well. And then post-sentencing, we are going to be providing them with notices of anything that happens in the case. If the defendant violates their probation, if they, die in custody. So throughout the life of the case, throughout the life of their sentence, we are the point of contact to find out what's going on with the case. And so I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Shim. I'm the Regional Coordinator for Workplace Crimes out of the Western Region in the Wage and Hour Division at the U.S. Department of Labor. So in our scenario, and hopefully you were able to take a look at the prompt that Raphael had described in the chat, when we're addressing Joe, my colleagues who have just spoken, we're referring predominantly to Joe's immediate needs, the benefits that he's entitled to, trying to secure safety for him, the various issues and interests that he may be interested in immediately. And so on behalf of the Wage and Hour Division, what our agency is able to do is predominantly twofold. So on the one hand, here, if we have found that Joe is a victim and a survivor of labor trafficking, the Wage and Hour Division is also one of the numerous many law enforcement certifying agencies. It's in the Q&A portion, some discussions about U and T visas. And so the Department of Labor has been codified in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act as being a law enforcement certifying agency. And what does that mean? So if Joe, and here we are going to presume that he is without immigration status and undocumented, he may be eligible to apply for a T visa or a U visa. And at the Wage and Hour Division, provided that we have, certain eligibility requirements met, and here we have them. We're looking for an employee and employer relationship, and obviously we have that here. And as long as we can do that, and we have the ability to certify him so that he may be able to apply for that T visa application. And so that's one of the numerous ways that we are able to assist, even though the Wage and Hour Division is a civil law enforcement agency. So whereas some of my colleagues have the ability to investigate labor trafficking criminally, we do not have the authority to investigate trafficking, but the Wage and Hour Division has enforcement to detect it. And in addition to that detection, what we are able to do is to provide back wages. And this is presuming that this is something that Joe is interested in. I know oftentimes labor trafficking survivors, they want to stabilize their immigration status. They want to be safe, have housing, have physical stability and safety, and may not be interested in back wages. And that is certainly fine. But to the extent that we can provide and assist with an investigation for back wages, the Wage and Hour Division can do that. And know that regardless of immigration status, every worker is entitled to back wages. And so the Wage and Hour Division, we enforce predominantly the Fair Labor Standards Act. But in this situation, as you can see, it looks as if Joe was doing domestic work, which we would have the authority to investigate that. But in addition, he was driving farm workers. So what is also great about the Wage and Hour Division being sort of the first line of defense in encountering workers or complainants or situations like this is then we have also the authority to investigate that farm. I would like to assume that Joe's traffickers in this situation is likely not legally employing their farm worker workforce, likely not paying properly the minimum wage and overtime, and likely not abiding by the laws under the H-2A, other agricultural provisions. So by Joe being able to be detected as a survivor of trafficking, we are then able to potentially trigger our ability to actually go to the farm and investigate the entire farm on behalf of all workers that are there. And again, regardless of status. And so ours is a two-pronged approach in which we are able to encounter labor trafficking survivors. And where oftentimes criminal law enforcement agencies require a subpoena or a search warrant to approach work sites or any sort of employment entities, the Wage and Hour Division does not need to do that. And so having mere detection of violations that are obviously committed by Joe's traffickers and the farmer, the whoever is forcing him to transport farm workers, then we are able to go there and to conduct these investigations on behalf of all the workers, in addition to Joe. And at this time, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Linda.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I want to say many thanks, particularly to Raphael, for coming up with this excellent scenario. And my colleagues for kind of spelling out, I hope you're seeing this sort of as a multi-dimensional, four-dimensional scenario where you're moving through time and you're moving through the pyramid of needs that somebody who might be the target of labor trafficking, how they might possibly interface with all our different agencies. My name is Linda Lee. I am an education and outreach coordinator for the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission out of San Francisco District. I use she, her pronouns. And like Jen, I work for a civil rights agency. And as you digest all this fascinating information, I can't wait to go back and look at that ASU report. And I'm turning over all the information we've learned today. I'm thinking about where EEOC is. And my ask to all of you is that think of EEOC as a tool to add to your toolbox as we're trying to solve this problem of labor trafficking. By using the laws that EEOC enforces, you're adding civil rights laws to possibly a criminal prosecution. We use different analysis, different means of proof, and different remedies. And so it may complement, or it may be easier in some cases to use our laws to provide some kind of remedy and justice to the workers being trafficked. So again, going to the excellent questions that Raphael has framed for us, it's very clear that the laws that EEOC enforces protects individuals regardless of immigration status or authorization to work. And we have the hard experience of cases where workers are undocumented and have protected them by obtaining temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions to protect those workers from retaliation and threat of deportation. Like Department of Labor, EEOC is a certifying agency for U visas, and we may also be able to certify T visas, right? This is in order to help workers who may be victims of certain crimes remain in the US and continue to work as long as they're cooperating with an enforcement agency like EEOC. Now, if Joe happens to be a member of the LGBTQ community, the way it may be relevant under EEOC's analysis is that we have laws that protect you from discrimination based on sexual orientation and or gender identity. Was the worker treated differently, less for being LGBTQ? If they were not hired or not promoted or given certain kind of duties, that's something we would want to hear about in our analysis. And also we'd want to know, was that person harassed? Was Joe being harassed for being LGBTQ? So if there were offensive name calling, slurs regarding sexual orientation or gender identity or gender transition, or deliberate intentional misuse of pronouns, that's something we'd want to hear about. If there was physical touching, intimidation, or threats, that's something we'd want to hear about. And harassment could be from a supervisor, a coworker, somebody who's not an employee. It could be a client or a customer. We were talking about restaurants. We were talking about other types of workplaces. So just wanted to make that clear. And as to the question of, does it matter if it was Joe, Joe female or male, how does that impact your status before EEOC? You could be labor trafficked, as the study showed, whether you're male or female, right? No matter your gender, your sexual orientation, or gender identity. A sexual harasser could be same or opposite sex, and there doesn't have to be lust or sexual attraction involved for us to find sexual harassment. But maybe one thing we will note that often women workers are more frequently targeted for sexual harassment. So ultimately, what I want to say is EEOC uses a slightly different lens to look at and can be applied to labor trafficking, because it's often aimed at people who are vulnerable, whether due to their immigration status, their gender. We've also had labor trafficking cases on behalf of people with disabilities, could be intellectual disability or what have you, who've also been targeted for exploitative labor conditions, enforced housing, restriction of rights, medical care, food, that sort of thing. So I encourage you to think sort of outside the box so we don't miss some of these other people who have been impacted by labor trafficking. With that, I'd like to turn it back to Raphael in case there are any other questions you'd like to pose to my fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So in the questions, is there any civil remedies that could be offered to Joe. Another question that could be answered by whoever wants to take on these questions. What would happen if Joe did not have any legal status? What would be the process for immigration relief?
Hello, sir. I'm happy to initiate that discussion. So much
Thank you,
like
Michael.
much like my peers who just presented that their agencies are certifying agencies, Homeland Security is also a certifying agency for both TU visas, but also for continued presence. Continued presence is important because it always sometimes gets forgotten. Continued presence is a DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking related program that provides temporary immigration relief for victims of severe forms of human trafficking that allows those victims to remain in the U.S. for a period of 2 years. And that immigration relief is renewable in 1-year increments. It's designed to help stabilize victims enough so that they can access all the benefits that we described earlier, and so that the victims, once they become stabilized enough, can provide enough information that can help and aid in the investigation of the human trafficking related experience. In addition to assisting with the continued presence, we also would work with the defense counsel who would likely develop a T visa for the victim. Now, while the T visa doesn't necessarily require a legal certification, the defense counsel may likely ask for one because it often, having the legal certification from an agency often bolsters the case or the claim when presented to USCIS for processing that this is actually a victim of human trafficking and they should be considered for the T visa protection. The T visa, as it was indicated earlier, would replace the continued presence. All the same benefits would be enjoyed by the T visa. It's a 4-year stabilization, renewable in 4-year block. And both the continued presence and the T visa will come with a work permit so that the survivor will be able to work as well. I'll now turn it over to my other peers who may have responses to this question as well.
And I can address a little bit more deeply. My previous discussion was kind of an overview of what Wage and Hour can do. So, Michael at HSI and Department of Homeland Security, they're the ones that are able to do continued presence, which I think is an excellent benefit for a survivor of trafficking. And so with regard to the UNT visa certification process, with the Wage and Hour Division, as I had mentioned, it's fairly simple in terms of our ability to first have the requirements to be able to certify on behalf of, in this situation, it would be for Joe. And so what we are looking for is, a workplace scenario, an employer and employee relationship. And I say that because unfortunately, in instances of, a domestic situation, or in instances in which perhaps the Wage and Hour Division or the Department of Labor may not have the authority over the incident or the trafficking situation, then we have the ability to refer out to other partner agencies. We also have the ability to make criminal referrals. In this scenario, in the way that my colleagues and I discussed this, our criminal partners with the U.S. Attorney's Office, they came first. They were able to have their victim witness assistance and to provide all of those immediate benefits. Now, this is assuming that potentially maybe the U.S. Attorney's Office or a criminal law enforcement agency does not find trafficking or maybe can't prosecute trafficking beyond a reasonable doubt. There's scenarios that happen in cases such as this in which numerous agencies can still help to fill in gaps. And what I mean by that is, as I had mentioned, back wages is another way to assist in a civil way with any survivor of trafficking, and especially in any sort of workplace exploitation scenario. So my role actually at the Department of Labor is not only to assist survivors of trafficking, but we also assist with retaliation and labor exploitation. So anything even just shy of labor trafficking would fall under our purview. But back to the UNT visa certification process, what it would be is currently the Department of Labor does not require an active or an ongoing investigation for Joe in this scenario or for any worker to come forward to request that certification from us. It's provided as long as we hit our eligibility requirements, and I could always do a deeper dive into our actual requirements. But that said, that is not a barrier. So if in this instance, Wage and Hour did not get involved because perhaps Joe is actively involved with Maureen at the U.S. Attorney's Office and a prosecution, we would not be having a simultaneous civil investigation while the criminal investigation is ongoing. That wouldn't preclude Joe from being able to come forward and ask for that certification from us. And so that usually requires an interview with myself or a colleague, and then we would make a determination based off of what's occurred, and then decide whether to issue that certification or not. And so, as Linda has mentioned, there are ways to protect a survivor of trafficking, in many numerous angles. And so, we at Labor we make a lot of sense in order to assist, even though, as I had mentioned, we don't have the authority to actually investigate the trafficking. There are ways that we partner with our criminal partners, and we're so grateful to HSI, we're so grateful to U.S. attorneys and FBI, and we do that a lot. So to know that we are also part of task forces around the country. So there are many numerous ways that we can target, whatever the needs of the survivor, we can assist and do it jointly together.
I'm just going to go ahead and jump in and say, again, EEOC hopefully is a tool that you can think of as complementing some of the other things you're analyzing. So we offer civil remedies. And I think we have some interesting stories that we'll try to share through the link shared afterwards, where EEOC has been able to call in and be a partner to obtain justice for workers, where the analysis of what they went through really fits with the laws that we enforce. And that was the most effective way to get them justice. So I'm hoping that my brief introduction to what we're talking about will start getting people thinking. And if you ever have questions, I hope you feel free to contact me. I'm going to drop my contact information into the webinar chat. You can email me or call me anytime you have questions, because I know there's a lot of information to process. Somebody asked a really great question. What's the time limit for EEOC? Our statutes say 180 days, but in many states, it has been extended to 300 days. Again, what I would say is you don't have to be an expert in all our arcana and details. Please feel free to reach out to us with questions anytime you have them. And I'll put my contact information into the chat.
I think one thing that I wanted to also mention was that, because we have the Department of Labor and the EEOC mentioned, and then of course we have the criminal side that the U.S. Attorney's Office does, but also survivors can get an attorney, a victim's rights attorney or a regular attorney that will pursue whoever victimized them civilly in the civil courts. So that's another option as well.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, everyone, for sharing this information. I know we're running out of time. We have like 5 minutes. So I would like the presenters to share any last thoughts before we close the session that you may have.
Mike, I didn't mean to bump you out. Again, I think for me, what I've learned from listening to everybody who came before and thinking about that great study, and also Rafael, you sharing your story and this anecdote with us is there's sort of immediate needs. There's sort of a time frame in which things unfold, and I keep imagining, what would I feel like if I were the worker impacted, right? I would feel so vulnerable. There's so many barriers. How do you even start to know where you can find help? I'm thankful to all the people who are attending today to gain this expertise, and hopefully, you know, you're learning about all these different organizations and agencies. I would just say you don't have to be the expert. We don't expect the worker to become the expert. We don't expect the advocates to be the expert, but we're just hoping you're like, okay, EEOC, let's put them in our Rolodex, or let's put them in our phone. If we have a question concerning possible workplace discrimination or harassment based on national origin, possibly disability or gender identity, think about calling EEOC. Like, just add us to the toolkit, loop us in, make us part of your team. And the same with everybody else here. I've learned so much about my partners and thinking about where we fall within the process, and how do we turn all of this into empowerment for the vulnerable worker who is targeted. That's what I'm excited about, this collaboration and gathering of information. Okay, I turn it over to my colleagues.
And I'll continue off of what Linda was saying. And I appreciate what she was saying, because it's a lot of information that we have given you. There are so many federal agencies and partners. And as Linda mentioned, we don't expect you all, those who represent, survivors, those who are survivors, who understand that you may not know where to go. If you have just one idea, I'm at Department of Labor, so it makes sense if there's a labor situation to come to us. We will assist in trying to do those referrals. There is a saying that we have used sort of internally with some of these task forces, with some of our partnerships, is there's no wrong doors. So obviously those who have representation, who have immigration attorneys, who have other attorneys, civil attorneys, who have even a prosecutor assisting that has a victim witness program, go to one of them, and then we will help triage. And so what we're hoping that you took away from this is a real life scenario. And there are immediate things that need to be met for a survivor. And then once things have settled and things have stabilized, then we as federal partners want to be able to then come in and assist where that survivor needs and wants. As I had mentioned earlier, it may not be that the survivor even wants to face, Joe may not want to face his trafficker in court, may not even care at this point to have his back wages returned to him, but maybe it is to stabilize immigration status. And so we would like to think that at least we can be partners in understanding the survivor's needs, and then work from there. And so we will never force, you must, have your back wages met if it's something that they're not interested in. And so understand that our intent is to have this no wrong doors approach. So if that is something that you can at least take away from this real life scenario, in which many agencies at the state, local, and federal level, this panel is just federal partners, but there are many other agencies at the state, local level that can also directly assist. So with that, I hope that, the takeaway is that we are here to assist. We are here to provide whatever we can to stabilize and to make that survivor feel whole.
With that, we have 1 minute. I would like to thank the panelists. I know there's only a title, being the vice chair of the council, but I'm a survivor. I'm a male survivor of labor trafficking, and I'm so grateful and thankful for all the information shared. I'm going to emphasize, you don't have to be the expert or the hero. You have to be a good human being who cares about humanity and who is willing to work and support survivors in a proper way for they to, be stabilized and restart their life that they deserve. So thank you very much for attending, and I will pass it on to Pete.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Amazing job. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you to everybody. I learned a lot myself. I hope that all of you did as well. And not to mention it again, but I mean, what Linda said, and then was reiterated by Jennifer and now just Rafael, there is no wrong door. We have heard from no less than 5 federal departments today. And we live in a confusing morass of acronyms and different roles and responsibilities, but there really is no wrong door. I'm with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but while we may not be the ones to address a particular case, we will know where to send you. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us for specific questions or even broad questions, and we will make sure that you get to the right place. I just want to, share my thanks to all the presenters, to all of you for joining. Really, really appreciate it. I want to give a special shout out to Emily Hughes, who works on my team, for organizing this. This is not the end of our engagement on trafficking, particularly on labor trafficking. And you have our commitment absolutely to continue the momentum and make sure that we're doing our best to serve victims and survivors. So with that, again, you will get an email follow-up with resources, the recordings, the PowerPoint presentations, and everything else. And there will be more to come. And with that, we will close just a couple minutes early. And again, really want to thank everyone for joining.